from rounds that were found near the suspected shooter contain messages that are anti-ICE in nature.
FBI agents have uncovered an unused bullet casing etched with anti-ICE, and detailed attack notes point to a disturbing motive in the case of the Texas ICE shooter. But the darkest revelation behind this evidence is only just beginning to surface, and it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Texas ICE. Let's get into it. The attack that shook America's immigration enforcement. The morning of September 24, 2025, started like any other at the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Field Office in Dallas, Texas. Federal agents were conducting routine operations, transport vans were moving detainees through the facility's secured entry points, and the business of immigration enforcement was proceeding as usual. But at approximately 6:40 a.m., everything changed in the most horrifying way imaginable. What began as a typical Tuesday morning quickly transformed into a nightmare that would send shockwaves through America's immigration enforcement apparatus and fundamentally alter how we understand the growing threat of domestic terrorism targeting federal agencies. The events that unfolded in those terrifying moments would not only claim innocent lives, but also expose a chilling pattern of premeditated violence that investigators are now calling one of the most disturbing cases of targeted terrorism they've ever encountered. The attack occurred at the ICE field office located at 8101 North Stemmons Freeway in northwest Dallas, a facility that serves as a critical hub for immigration enforcement operations in the region. This wasn't just any random government building. It was a fortress of federal law enforcement activity, housing not only ICE personnel but also FBI, ATF, DEA, and other federal partners who work shoulder to shoulder in the complex mission of immigration enforcement. The shooter, later identified as 29-year-old Joshua John, had positioned himself with methodical precision on the rooftop of a 3-story immigration attorney's office building. From this elevated vantage point, he commanded an unobstructed view of his intended targets, a clear line of sight estimated at approximately 500 feet, nearly 2 football fields away from the back of the ICE building.
Google Earth gives us the early morning vantage point he had. From the roof of the 3-story building, he had a clear line of sight estimated at 500 feet, nearly 2 football fields, to the back of the ICE building.
The tactical advantage that Jan had secured was no accident. This was not the impulsive act of a disturbed individual acting on sudden rage or mental breakdown. Every aspect of his positioning, from the selection of the rooftop to the timing of the attack, demonstrated what federal investigators would later describe as a high degree of pre-attack planning that transformed what might have appeared to be random violence into something far more sinister and calculated. The attack began with methodical precision that chilled even experienced law enforcement officers to the bone. Witnesses described a terrifying pattern of gunfire that seemed almost mechanical in its execution.
He would shoot, he would wait 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, he would shoot.
This wasn't the frenzied shooting of someone who had lost control. It was the calculated firing pattern of someone who was taking his time, choosing his targets, and executing a plan with deadly efficiency. The deliberate pauses between shots suggested a shooter who was methodically acquiring targets, adjusting his aim, and ensuring maximum impact with each round fired. The primary target of John's assault was a transport van carrying ICE detainees through the facility's secured sally port. These unmarked vehicles are a routine part of ICE operations, transporting individuals in federal custody between facilities, courthouses, and other locations as part of the immigration enforcement process. On this particular morning, the van that became the focal point of the attack was carrying 3 detainees who were simply in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The bullets that John fired with such methodical precision found their marks with devastating effect. One detainee was killed instantly, while 2 others were critically injured, their lives forever changed by an act of violence that they had no part in creating and no way to anticipate or prevent. These individuals, who were already in federal custody and facing their own legal challenges related to immigration status, became the unintended victims of an attack that was meant to target the very system that held them. What makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking is the randomness with which these particular victims were selected. The Mexican consulate confirmed that one of the wounded was a Mexican national, highlighting the international implications of an attack that was fundamentally about American domestic policy and enforcement. These weren't high-profile targets or individuals who had any connection to the shooter's apparent grievances. They were simply human beings who happened to be in federal custody at at the moment when Joshua John decided to act on his extremist beliefs. The physical evidence left behind at the scene told a story that was both immediately obvious and deeply disturbing. Investigators discovered bullet holes not only in the transport van but also inside the ICE building itself, including damage to a framed picture of the American flag. A detail that seemed to underscore the symbolic nature of the attack against American federal authority and the institutions of law enforcement. But perhaps most chilling of all was what happened in the final moments of this terrifying ordeal. As law enforcement officers converged on the scene, their training and experience kicking in to respond to what was clearly an active shooter situation, Joshua John made a decision that would forever limit our understanding of his full motivations and planning. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, taking with him to the grave the complete story of how he came to commit this act of domestic terrorism. The immediate response from law enforcement was swift and professional, but the scene they encountered was unlike anything most of them had experienced in their careers. Dallas Police Department officers were the first to arrive, and they faced the immediate challenge of securing a scene where they knew a sniper was still active and potentially targeting anyone who approached the building.
Their officers got to the scene. They actually transported people in their squad cars, the wounded, because they could not send Dallas Fire Rescue in immediately because it was an active shooter and they thought there was obviously a sniper on the roof.
This detail illustrates the immediate danger that law enforcement faced and the split-second decisions they had to make while lives hung in the balance. The fact that police officers had to transport wounded victims in their own squad cars because it was too dangerous to send in emergency medical services speaks to the ongoing threat that John posed even after his initial attack. As the morning progressed and the immediate danger was neutralized, a massive federal investigation began to unfold. The FBI took control of the scene, working alongside multiple federal agencies in what would become one of the most comprehensive domestic terrorism investigations of the year. The Joint Terrorism Task Force was activated, bringing together resources from across the federal law enforcement community to piece together not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether there were other threats that needed to be addressed. What investigators discovered in those first crucial hours would set the stage for revelations that would shock even seasoned federal agents and fundamentally change how America views the growing threat of domestic terrorism targeting immigration enforcement. The evidence they uncovered would reveal a level of planning and ideological motivation that transformed this from a seemingly isolated incident into something far more ominous and systematic. The attack on the Dallas ICE facility was not occurring in a vacuum. This was unfortunately just the most recent example of targeted violence against immigration facilities, including a July 4th coordinated attack carried out against an immigration detention center in Alvarado, Texas. The pattern that was emerging was one of escalating violence against federal immigration enforcement, with each incident seemingly more brazen and more dangerous than the last. Federal officials had been warning for months about an unprecedented increase in threats, violence, and attacks against ICE personnel, with some reports indicating increases of 700% to 1,000% in assaults on federal immigration officers. The Dallas shooting represented not just another data point in this disturbing trend, but potentially a new level of sophistication and planning that suggested the threat was evolving in dangerous new directions. As the investigation continued through that first day and into the evening, federal agents worked methodically to process the crime scene and begin building a comprehensive profile of Joshua John and his motivations. What they would discover would not only explain the attack that had just occurred, but would also reveal evidence of planning and preparation that suggested this was just the beginning of what could have been an even more devastating campaign of domestic terrorism. The full scope of the FBI's terrifying discovery was still hours away from being revealed, but already the foundations were being laid for understanding that would change everything about how America approaches the protection of its federal immigration enforcement infrastructure and the dedicated men and women who risk their lives every day to enforce the nation's immigration laws. The FBI's shocking discovery, a web of premeditation and terror. As federal investigators delved deeper into the evidence left behind by Joshua John, what they discovered sent chills through the highest levels of law enforcement and intelligence agencies across the country. This was not the work of a mentally unstable individual acting on impulse, or the random violence of someone who had simply snapped under pressure. Instead, the FBI uncovered a carefully orchestrated campaign of domestic terrorism that had been months in the making, with evidence pointing to a level of planning and ideological commitment that fundamentally changed how investigators investigators understood both this specific attack and the broader threat facing America's immigration enforcement apparatus. The first breakthrough came when investigators processed the physical evidence left at the scene of the shooting. What they found was so unusual and so deliberately crafted that it immediately elevated this case from a standard criminal investigation to a matter of national security. FBI Director Kash Patel released images of unspent shell casings that had been engraved with the phrase anti-ICE, a discovery that provided the first concrete evidence of the shooter's ideological motivations and his deliberate targeting of immigration enforcement.
In fact, the FBI released this photo showing the exact words anti-ICE scrawled on shell casings found on the roof.
But these inscribed shell casings were just the beginning of what investigators would uncover. The decision by FBI Director Patel to release these images so quickly after the attack was itself unusual, suggesting that law enforcement wanted to immediately establish the ideological nature of the attack and potentially warn other potential targets about the specific threat they were facing.
What I can also share with you is that early evidence that we've seen from rounds that were found near the suspected shooter contain messages that are anti-ICE in nature.
The methodical nature of John's preparation became even more apparent when investigators discovered evidence of extensive digital surveillance and reconnaissance activities. Between August 19th and 24, 2025, John had been searching for applications that could track the locations of ICE agents, a chilling revelation that suggested he was not just planning a random attack on a federal building, but was specifically targeting individual law enforcement officers for potential harm. This digital footprint revealed a pattern of escalating research and planning that painted a picture of someone who was systematically preparing for an act of domestic terrorism. In the days immediately preceding the attack, on September 23, 24, John had researched ballistics and viewed videos related to the recent assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, suggesting that he may have been inspired by or seeking to emulate other acts of political violence that had recently occurred. The reference to Charlie Kirk is particularly significant, as the conservative activist had been fatally shot just 2 weeks earlier, on September 10, 2025, in what authorities also classified as targeted political violence. The temporal proximity between these two attacks, combined with evidence that John had been researching the Kirk assassination, raised serious questions about whether there might be a copycat element to the ICE facility attack or whether both incidents were part of a broader pattern of escalating political violence in America. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when investigators found and analyzed a handwritten note that John had left behind. The contents of this note revealed not just his anti-ICE ideology, but a specific intent to create ongoing psychological terror among federal law enforcement officers. The note read, "Hopefully this will give ICE agents real terror to think, is there a sniper with AP rounds on that roof?" This message revealed a level of psychological sophistication that went far beyond simple violence or revenge. John wasn't just seeking to harm ICE agents in this single attack. He was attempting to create a climate of ongoing fear and paranoia that would impact the daily operations of immigration enforcement across the country. The reference to AP rounds, armor-piercing rounds, and the specific imagery of snipers on rooftops was clearly designed to make every ICE agent wonder whether they might be in the crosshairs of a hidden shooter whenever they reported for duty. The psychological warfare aspect of John's plan became even more apparent when investigators considered the broader context of his attack. By positioning himself on a rooftop with a clear line of sight to the ICE facility, he was recreating the exact scenario that his note threatened: a sniper with armor-piercing rounds positioned to target federal agents. The message wasn't just a threat for the future, it was a promise that he was actively fulfilling in real time. Federal investigators also discovered that John had downloaded a Dallas County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management document that listed DHS facilities throughout the region. This finding raised the terrifying possibility that the attack on the ICE facility was not intended to be John's only target, but perhaps just the first in a planned series of attacks against federal immigration enforcement infrastructure. The sophistication of John's planning extended to his choice of position and timing. The rooftop of the immigration attorney's office building that he selected provided not just a clear line of sight to his target, but also symbolic significance. by attacking from a building associated with Immigration Legal Services, John May, have been making a statement about his view of the entire immigration system, seeing both enforcement and legal representation as part of what he perceived as an unjust system. As investigators worked to piece together the full scope of John's planning and preparation, they executed search warrants at multiple locations associated with the shooter. Federal agents searched homes in both Fairview, Texas, and Durant, Oklahoma, recovering additional devices and written materials that were still being analyzed. The multi-state nature of these searches suggested that John's network of preparation and potentially support was more extensive than initially believed.
The FBI left this home in Fairview tonight with a trunkload of evidence, including at least one computer.
The discovery of computers and digital devices was particularly significant, as these would contain the complete record of John's online research, communications, and potentially his connections to other individuals who might share his anti-ICE ideology. Federal investigators were working around the clock to analyze this digital evidence, looking for any indication of broader networks or additional planned attacks. What made John's case particularly puzzling to investigators was the disconnect between his apparent lack of previous extremist activity and the sophisticated nature of his attack planning. According to family members and childhood friends, John was described as the least political out of all the people I knew in high school, and was primarily interested in gaming and internet culture rather than political activism or extremist ideology.
John's friends said he was a gamer, mainly interested in internet culture.
This apparent contradiction between John's previous apolitical lifestyle and his eventual commitment to deadly political violence became a key focus of the FBI investigation. How does someone who shows no outward signs of political extremism or violent tendencies develop the commitment and capability to carry out such a sophisticated act of domestic terrorism? The answer to this question would have profound implications for how law enforcement identifies and prevents future attacks. The timeline of John's radicalization appeared to be relatively compressed, with most of the concrete evidence of his anti-ICE planning occurring in the weeks and months immediately preceding the attack. This suggested that his transformation from an apparently apolitical individual to a committed domestic terrorist happened relatively quickly, raising questions about what triggers or influences might have accelerated this process. Federal investigators were also grappling with the broader implications of John's attack methodology. The use of a sniper-style attack from an elevated position, combined with the psychological warfare elements of his planning, represented a concerning evolution in domestic terrorism tactics. Previous attacks on federal facilities had typically involved more direct confrontations or bombing attempts, but John's approach suggested a level of tactical sophistication that could inspire copycat attacks or represent a new model for domestic terrorists to follow. The full implications of these discoveries would not only change how law enforcement approached the protection of ICE facilities and personnel, but would also fundamentally alter the national conversation about domestic terrorism, political violence, and the safety of federal law enforcement officers who are tasked with enforcing America's immigration laws. A pattern of terror, the broader campaign against immigration enforcement. As the FBI's investigation into Joshua John's attack continued to reveal the sophisticated nature of his planning and ideological motivations, a disturbing picture began to emerge of a much larger and more systematic campaign of violence targeting America's immigration enforcement apparatus. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident was quickly revealed to be part of an escalating pattern of domestic terrorism that had been building throughout 2025, with attacks becoming more frequent, more sophisticated, and more deadly with each passing month. The Dallas ICE facility shooting was not occurring in a vacuum, and federal investigators soon realized that they were dealing with what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of domestic terrorism targeting immigration enforcement infrastructure across multiple states. This was the third assault on Texas ICE and Border Patrol facilities in 2025 alone, representing an unprecedented level of sustained attack against federal law enforcement agencies tasked with immigration enforcement. The pattern that emerged was both systematic and escalating. On July 4th, 2025, suspects dressed in black military gear had opened fire outside the Prairieland Detention Center in Alvarado, Texas, resulting in a police officer being shot in the neck. More than a dozen people were arrested in connection with that attack, which investigators determined was a coordinated assault involving multiple participants who had specifically planned to target immigration enforcement personnel. Just 3 days after the Alvarado attack, a man with a rifle opened fire on a Border Patrol center in McAllen, Texas, managing to shoot an officer in the knee before authorities authorities were able to neutralize the threat. The rapid succession of these attacks suggested a level of coordination or inspiration that went beyond coincidental timing. Even more concerning was the discovery that the same Dallas ICE facility that John attacked had been the target of a bomb threat just 1 month earlier, in August 2025. In that incident, a man had arrived at the facility claiming to have a bomb in his backpack with a detonator, though he was immediately taken into custody. The fact that the same facility had been targeted twice in such a short period suggested that anti-ICE extremists were specifically focusing their attention on high-value targets within the immigration enforcement infrastructure. The escalation in both frequency and sophistication of these attacks had prompted federal officials to issue increasingly urgent warnings about the threat facing immigration enforcement personnel. Reports indicated that assaults on ICE officers had increased by 700% to 1,000% compared to previous years, representing an unprecedented level of violence directed against federal law enforcement.
What I want is people to understand that the men and women of ICE are doing a law enforcement mission. They're sworn law enforcement officers just like everyone else. And these attacks and the rhetoric and the threats against ICE agents and their families needs to stop for all law enforcement.
Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons made it clear that these attacks were not just targeting ICE as an organization, but were threatening the entire federal law enforcement community that works in immigration enforcement. The Dallas ICE facility housed not just ICE officers, but also FBI, ATF, DEA, and other federal partners, meaning that attacks on such facilities represented threats to the entire federal law enforcement apparatus. The response from political leaders reflected the seriousness with which federal officials viewed this escalating threat. President Trump posted on Truth Social that ICE agents were facing an unprecedented increase in threats, violence, and attacks by deranged radical leftists, while Democratic leaders called for restraint in rhetoric that could further inflame tensions. Vice President J.D. Vance was even more direct in his assessment of the threat, specifically linking the attack to what he characterized as left-wing extremist ideology.
An ICE facility, an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement facility, was opened fire upon by a violent left-wing extremist, a person who wrote anti-ICE messaging on their bullets.
The political implications of these attacks extended far beyond the immediate security concerns. A Quinnipiac University poll conducted after the Charlie Kirk assassination found that 71% of Americans considered political violence to be a very serious problem, with only 4% dismissing it as not a serious concern. The fact that the Dallas ICE attack occurred exactly 2 weeks after the Kirk assassination raised additional concerns about copycat effects and the potential for political violence to inspire additional attacks. The timing and methodology of John's attack bore disturbing similarities to the Kirk assassination, including the use of sniper-style tactics from elevated positions and the inscription of ideological messages on ammunition. These parallels suggested that domestic terrorists were learning from and adapting the tactics of previous attackers, potentially creating a cycle of escalating violence and sophistication. Federal law enforcement agencies responded to this pattern by implementing enhanced security measures at immigration facilities across the country. Following the Dallas attack, ICE facilities nationwide were placed on higher alert, with additional security protocols and increased coordination with local law enforcement agencies to prevent future attacks.
Following today's shooting in Texas, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department increased patrols around the ICE processing center in Adelanto.
It would only seem obvious that if there was any bad actor out there planning to do something, that could potentially be a target.
The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Immigration attorneys and advocates reported that their clients were increasingly fearful of attending routine immigration proceedings, worried that they might become victims of violence simply by being present at federal immigration facilities. The attacks were achieving exactly what John's note had threatened, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that disrupted the normal operations of immigration enforcement and support services.
It makes me emotional because we come to these appointments and never know what could happen. And after today,
they fear what could happen to them.
The international implications of these attacks also became apparent as foreign governments began expressing concern about the safety of their nationals in U.S. immigration custody. The Mexican consulate's confirmation that one of the wounded in the Dallas attack was a Mexican national highlighted how domestic terrorism targeting immigration enforcement could have diplomatic and international national consequences beyond the immediate victims. As federal investigators continued to analyze the evidence from John's attack and its connections to the broader pattern of anti-ICE violence, they were forced to confront some uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of current counterterrorism strategies. How had a network of domestic terrorists been able to carry out multiple sophisticated attacks against federal facilities without being detected or prevented? What intelligence gaps existed that allowed individuals like John to plan and prepare for months without coming to the attention of federal authorities? The investigation also raised questions about the role of online radicalization and the ways in which extremist ideologies were being spread and reinforced through digital networks. John's background as someone who was mainly interested in internet culture suggested that his radicalization may have occurred primarily through online channels, potentially making it more difficult for traditional law enforcement surveillance to detect. The broader implications of the FBI's discoveries went beyond immediate security concerns to fundamental questions about the nature of domestic terrorism in America and the adequacy of current prevention and response strategies. The sophistication and coordination of the attacks targeting immigration enforcement suggested that domestic terrorist networks were becoming more organized, more tactically sophisticated, and more committed to sustained campaigns of violence against federal authorities. Federal officials were also grappling with the challenge of balancing security measures with the need to maintain normal operations at immigration facilities. The goal of domestic terrorism is not just to cause immediate harm, but to disrupt normal operations and create a climate of fear that prevents government agencies from carrying out their missions. The extent to which enhanced security measures and increased vigilance were necessary represented a victory for the terrorists, even as they were essential for protecting federal personnel and the public. If you enjoyed watching this video, then go ahead and click on any of the cards on your screen for more.